Did I just hear a gunshot? Well, I'm sure if it's a real emergency, somebody will take care of it. Social psychology is one of the most interesting fields of psychological research, in my opinion. It's the scientific study of how individuals behave, think, and feel in a social situation. It consists of how people act around others, whether those people are, actually there or they just believe that there are other people there, and how people communicate and influence others. One of the interesting topics that's had a lot of research is culture, because culture is definitely like a social force. It's like a social influence that is shared by everybody who has that culture. You can think of culture as like an ongoing pattern of life that's passed from one generation to the next. It's basically like social influence and social psychology that spans multiple generations. You should think of culture as just how your ancestors continue to influence you today. Prosocial behavior is, to put it simply, behavior that helps people, behavior that benefits others. And, when you cooperate with people, when you show sympathy to other people, that's prosocial. So if you dial 911 when you see somebody get injured, you're demonstrating prosocial behavior. If you give money to charities, that's prosocial behavior, and so on. Buying cookies from Girl Scouts, whatever. But a lot of this kind of prosocial behavior is motivated by what we call altruism. And altruism is just simply the act of providing assistance, providing help when it's needed, despite any apparent reward. So there's no obvious way that you're going to be reimbursed or paid for your assistance. One of the most interesting series of studies on prosocial behavior looked into what's called the bystander effect or bystander apathy. This just refers to an unwillingness of bystanders, like strangers, to help an individual during an emergency. Now, there's a lot of reasons why people won't provide help during an emergency, but this bystander effect is directly addressing the number of people present during this emergency. And what we see is that it's actually kind of counterintuitive. It's the opposite of what you might think. What we actually see, what the research has clearly shown, is that the more bystanders that are present during an emergency, the less likely any single one of them will provide help. We can explain this using the term diffusion of responsibility. So just imagine you're a bystander and you're in a public place and there's a lot of other people around, and then somebody falls down and clearly looks like they hurt themselves. One of the first things that you're going to do in this kind of a situation is this. What that little turning your head thing is you're looking at what other people are doing. You're looking at what the other bystanders are doing. How are they reacting? Do they seem to think that this is an emergency? Like, you're just kind of, non-verbally, almost like subconsciously asking the other bystanders what you should do. And when you see that they do the same thing, and everybody is asking everybody what they should do, nobody does anything. So that's how this kind of thing can happen. With the diffusion of responsibility, you're recognizing the fact that there's tons of people here, and any single one of them can provide help. So you don't feel the burden. You don't feel the burden of responsibility because it's spread out amongst a large group of people. So just, counterintuitively, the more people that are present during an emergency situation, the less likely any of them will provide help. So I have a really cool video talking, about this research in the comments. You should definitely check that out because it really clearly demonstrates how this diffusion of responsibility can work, and it helps to explain why it even seems to happen in the first place. Now that you know about the diffusion of responsibility, you can actually overcome it to a certain extent. So here's what I mean. When you're in a public place and there's something that appears to be an emergency, like somebody might need some help, this is what you should do. You should just ask yourself, if I was all alone, if there was nobody else here, how would I respond to this? And if your answer is you would rush to the person's aid and provide them with help, then do that. Well, because, like I was just explaining, if you're in a crowded public place, everybody is equally unlikely to do anything. So if you take that initiative, if you're the first person to recognize this as an emergency and recognize that you need to do something, what you'll most often find is that the others will see you, recognizing that this is an emergency, and they'll actually come to help you as well. It's kind of like they'll just follow your lead. So even if you don't know how to help, even if you're not a doctor or anything like that, all you really need to do is just look at all the other bystanders and say, we need to do something. This guy needs our help. Can somebody help him? So that's all you need to do in most cases to provide support for somebody who needs it. One of the most important qualities that we have to have in order to naturally want to engage in this prosocial behavior is called empathy. So empathy is something that most normal adults have. Very young children generally don't have a good empathy. It's something that has to develop, and it develops a bit later on, late into childhood, maybe even early teenage years. But empathy is just your ability to understand the emotional and physiological state of someone else. Like, you can tell if somebody has empathy because when they see other people in pain, they'll demonstrate some of that pain. This is like mirror neurons, if you remember when I was talking about that. So if you watch a sad scene in a movie and it makes you cry, that's empathy. So what happened there is that this empathic response was aroused. When you see these other people having an emotional experience, you have the exact same kind of emotional experience. So I have a video down in the comments that articulates what empathy is all about and how it's different from sympathy. And it's a really funny video, so you should definitely look into that. The kind of people who don't have empathy are people that we would generally call antisocials. So antisocial behavior is marked by a lack of empathy. Antisocial behavior is any kind of behavior that harms someone else. So I'm talking about things like theft or assault, vandalism, murder. So it's definitely motivated by a lack of empathy, but also there's a component of aggression. And we've talked a bit about aggression before. Remember, when you frustrate somebody, when you prevent somebody from reaching a goal, that's going to increase their aggression towards you, and they could lash out. So this brings us to what's called the frustration-aggression hypothesis, and it's all that says is what I just mentioned. The more frustrated you are, the more likely you are to show aggression. So if you lack empathy for somebody and they start to frustrate you, you're extremely likely to start getting violent with that person. And that's one of the major explanations we have for why people do these terrible things to other individuals. But there's other interesting research as well. Like, we know there's a genetic predisposition to showing aggression. So researchers have shown that in many animals, including humans, your likelihood, your probability of showing aggressive behavior is directly linked to your parents, people that you have similar genetic code. Like, one interesting study showed that children of violent parents, like if you have violent criminal parents, children who weren't even raised by those parents but simply had their similar kinds of genes are 4 times more likely to engage in similar violent crimes. So this certainly isn't fate. Whenever I talk about genes, I just want you to remember it's an increased risk, it's an increased probability. But just because your parents were violent criminals, that doesn't mean you have to be that way too. Other factors would include things like high levels of testosterone. The sex hormone for men, mostly it's testosterone, is going to peak in the early 20s. So most men reach the peak of their testosterone levels in the early 20s, and it's at this time that these men are also the most aggressive. So testosterone levels are pretty much directly linked to aggression. This is why you see most violent criminals are younger men. Older men have much lower levels of testosterone, so they tend to be a lot more mellow, a lot less, aggressive. And then there's a lot of other things that can also increase aggression, like brain damage, various drugs, high levels of childhood lead exposure, and so on. It's a long list. But something we've already talked about when I was talking about observational learning is that you can learn to be more or less aggressive. You can learn by observing others. So what Albert Bandura found with his Bobo doll study is that for a large part, acting aggressively, acting violently is learned by watching adults. So when children see adults act violently, they will copy much of that behavior. So we've used these findings from these early studies and many studies that have come later to explain how violent role models, aggressive models in our culture, on TV, in the movies, and cartoons and things like that, can actually increase a child's probability to start, committing violent crimes and things like that. So the evidence overwhelmingly supports this link between violent role models and violent behavior in children. The relationship, of course, is not perfect, and it's much more likely for a child who's already, genetically predisposed to show that aggression. But it seems abundantly clear. If you watch violent crap, you're going to act violently. So media violence is a very serious thing. But media violence, the media isn't always a bad guy. The media can be a good guy too. It just depends on what kind of role models are we exposing to children. So instead of having your children watch things that show violence and aggression and just, antisocial behavior, instead you could have children watch things that model prosocial behavior. And this is what most children's programming is aimed at doing. So if you remember as a child watching shows like Sesame Street or Barney or, one of the other kids shows that are out nowadays like, Dora the Explorer or something like that, these shows were designed to demonstrate prosocial behavior to children. That's the point of watching these shows. Like, as an adult, if you watch these shows, they can be unbearable because they're kind of unrealistic in many, many ways. But that's not the point. The point is to just show children how to be a good member of society, how to, contribute, how to empathize with other people. So it's very good to have children watch these kinds of programming. Now, something that's clearly linked to prosocial and antisocial behavior is cognitive dissonance. Cognitive dissonance is when you have an awareness of some kind of inconsistency between one set of beliefs that you hold and another, or between your beliefs and your behavior. It's just when there's like a mismatch or a contradiction, and that contradiction can cause you a lot of discomfort. It can make you very unhappy and very, just kind of edgy. So whenever we do this, whenever we have this kind of discomfort from cognitive dissonance, what we generally do is try to find a way to resolve it as quickly and efficiently as possible. But here's just an example of what feeling cognitive dissonance would be like. Let's say that you believe that you are a very kind and generous person, but then one day as you exit a store, you're approached by a homeless person. That person, asks you for some change. Because you're a kind and generous person, you feel compelled to give them the money. But at the same time, for whatever reason, you don't. So you don't give that homeless person money, even though your values, your beliefs say you should. And as you walk away, as you reject that individual and move on with your life, you're going to be thinking about what you just did, and you're going to be unhappy with yourself. You'll be trying to figure out why you did what you just did. And what most of us will do in this situation is kind of make up an excuse, try to justify our actions. Just say something like, oh, I didn't give him money because he'll probably just spend it on alcohol, or I didn't give him money because he was threatening me. Or, we tend to come up with all kinds of different justifications, but it's all about just trying to make us feel better about this kind of inconsistency between our beliefs and our behavior. The last thing I wanted to talk about is prejudice. So prejudice is when you have an attitude, opinion, or a belief about something or someone because of its membership in a group. And if you remember when I was talking about stereotypes in a previous video, I said that most cases stereotypes help us. It's good to be prejudiced about many kinds of things. Like if you see a big scary looking dog walking towards you, it's good to prejudice that dog. You should probably assume that that dog will act violently. So that's just one simple example of how being prejudiced can and usually is a good thing. Prejudice, though, is a very bad thing when we start applying it to groups of people. Because when we apply prejudice, when we make these kinds of prejudiced decisions or prejudiced ideas about people because of their membership in a group, then that often leads to discrimination. And discrimination is just when you engage in various behaviors that are, only directed towards a single kind of group of people. So you can discriminate in positive or negative ways. You can treat one group of people better than you would normally because of their membership in a group, or you could treat a group of people worse than you should normally just because they're in that group. So there's a lot of reasons why people discriminate. There's a lot of reasons why people develop these kinds of prejudiced beliefs. But one of the most interesting ones is called the realistic conflict theory. And the whole idea here is that when there are limited resources in a region, the different groups in that region will recognize that they don't have enough for everyone. So that will increase these different groups' competition with each other. And as competition increases, they start to kind of exaggerate or magnify the differences between the groups. So in a very short period of time, simply because of a lack of resource, a lack of money or a lack of food or something like that, the differences between these groups, which used to be minor, can become extreme, and before you know it, these groups are trying to kill each other because of those magnified differences. But there's a few other reasons why we develop these prejudiced beliefs. Another one is an us versus them mentality. So when you become a part of a social group, you tend to recognize, that each individual in that group is very unique. The in-group is full of beautiful and unique snowflakes. Every single person has their own personality and goals and things like that, right? So we tend to really kind of magnify the differences between individuals in our in-group. But everyone else, the people in the out-group, the people that we do not personally associate ourselves with, we tend to not see as many differences. We tend to kind of just lump them together. They all just kind of look the same. They all act the same, they sound the same. They appear to be homogeneous. There's really no difference between one of them and another. So this us versus them thinking can clearly lead to almost like a demonization of people in that outgroup. The last big theory about how prejudice works is called the social cognitive theory. So this is something we've already kind of talked about. With Albert Bandura, remember, he demonstrated that when children watch adults acting violently, they will also act violently. And that goes the same for prejudice. So when children watch adults show prejudice towards groups of people, they will adopt similar kinds of prejudice behaviors and beliefs. So people learn attitudes, they learn prejudice and hatred the exact same way as other kinds of behavior.